It's been 18 years, but I still check the woods every time the sun starts to rise. That fragile, perfect moment, the split second between deep night and burning dawn, that is when everything changed. We thought we were ready for anything those mountains could throw at us. Sudden storms, the occasional bear, the cold. We were seasoned, we were prepared. But we weren't ready for silence. We weren't ready for impossible geometry moving in the periphery of the forest. We certainly weren't ready for a shadow that could eclipse the rising sun, standing perfectly still, watching us. My brother always said you could feel death approaching. I used to think he was dramatic. Now I know the truth. You don't feel death, you feel the absence of everything else. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I was always drawn to the high places. My name is Elias Vance. Back then I was pushing 40, recently divorced and trying desperately to hold on to the only two things that truly mattered to me: my son, Sam, and my connection to the deep wilderness. For almost 15 years, I'd been working variations of the same job: seasonal search and rescue, Forest Service logistics, sometimes just clearing paths after massive winter storms. The smell of cold pine, damp earth, and wood smoke was my home. The routine was my salvation. The divorce had left a canyon inside me, a silence worse than any deep forest night. I felt like a failure, a man whose life had fractured into legal documents and visitation schedules. Sam was 8, at that perfect age where the world was still full of giants and magic, but he was starting to ask the hard, cynical questions that only city life could introduce. I needed him to know the real magic, the kind that smelled like sap and felt like muscle ache after a long hike. I needed him to be safe from the noise. This trip, however, wasn't just my usual solo venture or a quick father-son overnight. My brother, Marcus, had decided to join us, bringing his daughter Clara, who was a year older than Sam and possessed an endless, infectious curiosity. Marcus was my opposite: successful, clean-shaven, utterly competent in the corporate world, but stiff and uncomfortable the moment pavement turned to gravel. He was doing this for Clara, though, trying to reclaim some rugged authenticity he felt he'd lost. I knew he was doing it for me, too, trying to re-anchor the fractured family unit. We chose the North Cascades, an area so remote it felt like a deliberate mistake on the map. We drove for hours past the last cell service tower, past the point where the gravel roads dissolved into barely marked logging tracks. We were aiming for the edge of the Glacier Peak Wilderness boundary, a spot I knew well, a small, crescent-shaped clearing nestled beside a rapidly flowing tributary of the Sauk River. It was perfect. The river provided a constant, calming white noise. The surrounding forest, dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock, offered natural shelter. The first day was textbook perfection. Sam and Clara were immediate partners in crime, building tiny dams in the creek, yelling joyous challenges back and forth. We set up 2 tents, mine and Sam's, a sturdy dark green 4-person dome, and Marcus and Clara's lighter, brighter blue tent about 20 feet away, near the edge of the tree line where the shadows started to grow long. The air was crisp and clean, tasting faintly of high altitude and ozone. We built a roaring fire that night, cooking steaks and potatoes wrapped in foil. The kids roasted marshmallows until they were blackened, sticky catastrophes, laughing so hard their small bodies shook. Watching Sam's face illuminated by the dancing flames, the weariness and guilt that usually clung to me began to lift. This was it. This was the healing I had promised myself. Marcus, nursing a dark beer, even admitted, his voice low, "Elias, I forgot how much I needed this. It's quiet. Truly quiet." I remember looking up at the sky, an impossible velvet black dotted with so many stars the void felt overwhelming. I felt a deep, profound gratitude for the routine, for the known dangers, and for the simple reality of being a father in a perfect environment. We banked the fire down, zipped the kids into their sleeping bags after checking for ticks and stray dirt, and finally retreated to our own tents. The lull of the river was hypnotic. I fell asleep quickly, The deep, satisfying exhaustion of a man whose body has spent the day working exactly as it was designed to. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong didn't come in the dead of night, which is when the truly frightening things usually happen. It came just after midnight, a subtle, almost psychological shift in the environmental pressure. I woke with a gasp, not because of a sound, but because of the sudden, total absence of the river's sound. It was as if someone had thrown a massive blanket over the world, absorbing every vibration, every whisper of wind, every tiny nocturnal rustle. The white noise of the water, which had been the anchor of the night, was gone. I lay rigid, my heart instantly thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I tried to convince myself I was just waking up, that my ears were clogged, or that the river flow had momentarily decreased due to some upstream blockage. But that was ridiculous. This river roared. I carefully unzipped the inner mesh door of the tent and peered out. The moon, a waning crescent, offered just enough pale silver light to illuminate the clearing. The fire pit was a bed of glowing embers, radiating a faint orange halo. Everything looked normal. The blue silhouette of Marcus's tent was visible 20 feet away. The forest perimeter was a solid wall of darkness, utterly still. Not a leaf moved, not a branch creaked. And the silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the active negation of sound. When I inhaled, my breath sounded impossibly loud, coarse and ragged, echoing in my own ears like sandpaper. This was the moment when the old instincts, the ones honed over years of tracking missing people and spending weeks alone in deep country, took over. This was the moment the primal alarm system, built into the oldest part of the human brain, started screaming, "Wrong, wrong, wrong." A bear would make noise. A mountain lion would be sleek and silent, yes, but the woods around it would remain alive with the sounds of insects and air movement. This felt different. This felt like the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for a predator far higher up the food chain than anything I was trained to handle. I reached slowly for the powerful LED flashlight and my fixed-blade camping knife, keeping my movements agonizingly slow so as not to wake Sam, who was sound asleep beside me, his small body curled innocently in the warm sleeping bag. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. The heavy silence persisted. It pressed down on the camp, a tangible weight. I had the profound, unsettling feeling that I wasn't just being watched, I was being measured. Finally, unable to bear the inertia, I slid out of the sleeping bag, dressing quickly in my thick wool socks and hiking boots. I crept to the zipper of the main tent door, pulling it down inch by excruciating inch. The sound of the zipper moving in the profound silence was like tearing canvas. I froze, waiting, but nothing reacted. I stepped out into the clearing. The cold air hit my face, sharp and biting. I scanned the perimeter, focusing my senses. I didn't turn on the flashlight yet. Light destroys night vision, and I wanted to see what the darkness was doing. I walked toward the edge of the tree line, feeling the cold dew soak the grass through my boots. As I moved, I realized something critical about the silence. It wasn't just the ambient noise that was gone. The normal, low-frequency sounds of the forest floor, the subtle shifting of weight, the settling of branches, the constant low-level insect hum, had completely vanished. I stopped near a massive moss-covered boulder that marked the corner of our campsite. I inhaled deeply, trying to gather scent clues, and that's when the first layer of truth hit me. It was a smell unlike anything I had ever encountered in the woods, and I have smelled decay, burned flesh, rotting game, and the musky funk of bears in their dens. This was different. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, but deeply unnerving. It was powerfully musky, yes, reminiscent of a wet dog that had been rolling in stagnant water and earth, but overlaid with something sweet, almost sickly sweet, like fermented fruit left out in the sun, or a chemical used to process leather, but far more organic. There was a metallic undertone, too, like old blood. It was dense. It hung heavy in the cold, still air, and it was strongest right there near the edge of the forest, directly behind Marcus's tent. My knees felt suddenly weak. The hair stood up along my neck and arms, a visceral reaction that had nothing to do with the cold. This was not a bear. The smell was too complex, too intelligent, too present. It wasn't just an animal scent. It felt like the concentrated, undiluted odor of an ancient, unwashed presence. I gripped the hilt of my knife, my knuckles white, and slowly raised the heavy beam of the flashlight, aiming it low. I swept the beam along the ground near Marcus's tent. Nothing. Just pine needles and dirt. I started tracing the perimeter of the camp, moving slowly, painstakingly, through the trees, pushing aside low-hanging cedar branches. The scent was a pressure in my sinuses, a suffocating blanket. It followed me along the perimeter. And then, I heard it. It wasn't a growl or a snap. It was a sound that broke the profound silence with such unexpected force that I nearly dropped the flashlight. Thump. A single, muffled, incredibly heavy thump. It came from approximately 30 yards away, deeper in the woods, in the direction opposite the river. It sounded like a boulder, perhaps the size of a microwave oven, being gently set down on a bed of earth. It was a displacement of massive weight, executed with deliberate caution. The thump was immediately followed by a new layer of silence, a deeper, heavier silence than before, like the air itself had been knocked out of the atmosphere. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs, listening for footsteps, for cracking branches, for a telltale snort or heave of breath. Nothing. Whatever had made that sound was now utterly still, perfectly integrated into the black chaos of the hemlock grove. I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that whatever had just shifted weight had done so merely to adjust its vantage point. It was watching the tents. It had marked the location of the sleeping children. I felt a chilling realization flood my mind. I was not the predator. I was merely the bait. And I had broken the rule of the wilderness. Never let your guard down when you have brought the truly vulnerable into the heart of the wild. I stood there for what felt like an hour, sweat cooling rapidly on my forehead despite the freezing air. My mind cycled through possibilities. Elk, very large deer, a moose? But a moose would be clumsy. It would tear through brush. This was precision and mass combined. My immediate duty was to get back to Sam. I took a shallow breath, ready to retreat, when I caught a subtle movement in the pitch blackness between two tall, straight firs, a space Marcus and I had identified as a perfect natural chimney for the smoke to escape. I shone the beam directly into the gap. Nothing. Just the texture of the bark, the moss, the shadow. But the light beam revealed a subtle truth about the forest structure. A line of small dead branches, too high to be deer browse, perhaps 7 or 8 feet up, had been broken clean off. Not chewed, not snapped by wind, but broken cleanly, as if a hand, impossibly large and strong, had casually brushed them aside to gain a clear sightline into the camp. And then, just below that line, pressed into the mossy base of the largest tree, I saw the disturbed earth. It wasn't a full footprint, but a compression, a massive, flat indentation where something had been pressing its weight into the forest floor for a long time. It was far wider and flatter than any bear paw I had ever tracked. The metallic, musky smell intensified, hitting me in a suffocating wave. I didn't need any more evidence. I had encountered the physical evidence of Layer 2, but the mental evidence, the crushing realization of what kind of entity this level of quiet and stealth implied, was already overwhelming. I retreated, not running, but moving backward in a combat shuffle. My eyes locked on the tree line, knife held ready. I backed up until my feet touched the cold fabric of my own tent. I needed to wake Marcus. I needed to extract the children. Now. But before I could reach the zipper to my brother's tent, a long, low sound started, very deep in the throat, coming from the blackness where the scent was strongest. It wasn't a vocalization in the traditional sense, more like air being pushed through a massive, heavy structure. It was a profound, slow, rhythmic sigh. It sounded tired. It sounded ancient. And it sounded like it was standing directly over us. I froze, my hand hovering inches from Marcus's zipper. The sigh held, a deep, resonant rumble, vibrating through the ground and into the soles of my boots. It was a sound of massive lungs, a sound that spoke not of anger or hunger, but of weary, intense observation. It was a warning or perhaps a simple statement of presence. I am here. I am watching. I did not wake them then. I couldn't. The sound had paralyzed me, cementing the terror that if I broke the spell of silence, if I caused any sudden alarm, the being would react instantly, catastrophically. I spent the rest of the night standing guard outside my tent, flashlight off, knife ready, listening to the heavy, pulsing silence. I watched the stars wheel slowly across the gap in the trees. I smelled the primal musk and the sickly sweet odor that seemed to be coating the air. And I waited for the sunrise, praying for the light, believing that the dawn, the symbol of human safety, of visibility and warmth, would drive away the impossibilities of the dark. I had no idea how wrong I was. The true terror, the one that ended the family trip forever, was only waiting for the light to reveal its shape. It's been 40 years, and that single moment, the split second between the sun clearing the ridge and the shadow moving, that moment is still the sharpest memory I possess. It is the beginning and the end of my life as a normal man. I should have done something. Yelled, grabbed the rifle, anything. But I was frozen, reduced to a hollow vessel, watching something impossibly vast consume the light. Right there, 50 feet from my sleeping children. Before we continue, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The shadow was gone, not run, not hidden. It was simply absorbed back into the timberline, as if the light of the rising sun had dissolved it. Or perhaps, revealed it to be something that only existed in the cusp of dawn and darkness. But the air it left behind was dense and charged, like standing too close to high-voltage power lines. My internal gyroscope had spun out. The world was tilting, and I was holding on to a reality that was rapidly dissolving into mythology. My wife Sarah was the first to move, not physically, but in sound. It wasn't a scream, which would have been merciful. It was a choked, guttural whimper, the sound a wounded animal makes when it realizes the predator is still watching but choosing not to strike. She was crouched by the fire pit, clutching the heavy cast-iron skillet she had been preparing to set the bacon in, her knuckles white. Her eyes were fixed, not on the trees where it vanished, but on the vulnerable strip of ground between us and the blue dome of our main tent, and the smaller orange pup tent where young Tommy and Emily were still, mercifully, asleep. That ground was where the creature had chosen to stand, marking the boundary between us and the innocent. I don't know how long we stayed like that, two statues sculpted in pure, adrenaline-infused panic. But the silence that followed the departure was the most terrifying element of all. It wasn't the usual early morning forest silence, which is a composite of 1,000 tiny sounds. The rustle of pine needles, the drip of condensation, the distant shriek of a hawk anticipating the rising heat. This silence was absolute, a profound, immediate vacuum, as if every bird, every insect, every microscopic life form had collectively agreed to hold its breath until the danger passed. It felt engineered, unnatural, a deafening pressure against the eardrums, signaling that the threat was still pervasive, just hidden. My first coherent thought, the one that finally forced blood back into my limbs, was the proximity of the children. I had to confirm they were safe. I had to get to them. I needed to wrap them in my arms and pretend the last 30 seconds had been a lie. I remember lowering myself carefully, forcing my legs to move through the heavy dew-soaked grass. Every muscle screamed in protest, convinced that any sudden movement, any indication of life, would draw the immediate, overwhelming gaze of whatever had just vanished. I moved toward the tents, not running but crawling low, my breath catching in shallow, useless gasps. Sarah didn't take her eyes off the timberline. She was protecting the flank, the rear, locked in a protective trance. I was the point man, stumbling forward into the vacuum of the unknown. When I reached the blue tent, I knelt, placing my hand on the cold, taut nylon fabric. I could hear their gentle, even breathing inside. They hadn't seen it. The angle of the sun and the positioning of the tents had placed Sarah and me in the direct line of sight, but the children were sheltered by the shadows of their temporary home. A tidal wave of physical relief washed over me, immediately followed by the sickening realization I had brought them here. I had chosen this precise, beautiful, terrible spot. The guilt began its decades-long burrowing process into my soul right there, on my knees in the wet grass. I glanced back at Sarah. She silently shook her head. Don't wake them. She knew that waking them now meant explaining, and explanation was impossible. The thing we had witnessed defied every rational framework we possessed, and introducing that level of ontological horror to a 6- and 4-year-old was unforgivable. I finally stood up, gripping the small aluminum baseball bat we kept near the cooler for protection against raccoons or curious foxes. It felt ridiculously flimsy, a toy, a pathetic psychological crutch against the sheer, overwhelming scale and silent authority of that shadow. I walked the short distance to where the silhouette had been standing. The ground was still slightly cooler there, sheltered from the new sun by the lingering mist. I searched for minutes that felt like hours. I was looking for the impossible, evidence of something that had moved with the deliberate crushing grace of a locomotive, yet left absolutely no trace. The soil here was a mix of hard-packed earth from previous campers and a scattering of soft pine needles and mulch. Nothing. No deep depressions where 200, 300, maybe 400 pounds had momentarily rested. No displaced rocks. No crushed underbrush that would signal a hasty retreat. The area where the thing had paused was perfectly undisturbed, except for the morning dew, which was already beginning to evaporate under the growing heat of the sun. It was like the figure hadn't been standing on the ground, but rather floating just above it, a manifestation of pure mass and fear, existing just outside the laws of physics as I understood them. But then, I found the anomaly. It wasn't on the ground. About 5 feet off the ground, attached to the lowest limb of an old lodgepole pine, was a tiny strip of material. It was caught on a sharp splinter of bark, a splinter that looked suspiciously fresh, as if it had been grazed by something moving with incredible force. The material itself was coarse, heavy, almost like the fiber of an old thick carpet, brown bordering on black and damp with dew. I reached up and pulled it free. As I held it, a different scent hit me. The air had been mostly clean and cold up until now, but this scrap of material carried an odor that defied simple categorization. It wasn't the ripe, metallic stink of a decaying corpse, nor was it the sharp, acrid urine smell of a territorial bear. This was deeper, more elemental. It was thick, musky, almost sweet, like fermentation mixed with damp earth and something indefinably animalistic. But beneath the musk, there was a faint, unsettling scent of burning wood, like stale campfire smoke that had clung to thick fur for days. The texture was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't the fine, brittle fur of a deer or the slick coat of a coyote. It was thick, dense, and coarse like old horsehair mixed with boar bristle, yet it moved with a surprising fluid softness when I ran my finger across the grain. It was layered, designed to shed water and hold heat. I realized with a sickening drop in my stomach that this wasn't fabric at all. It was hair, and it was unequivocally not bear hair. I dropped the piece instantly as if it had burned me. It fell into the pine needles, and in a moment of panicked, desperate denial, I kicked a small pile of duff over it, hiding it from Sarah's view. She had enough to deal with, the trauma etched into her face, turning her normally rosy complexion a sickly gray. I returned to her side, sinking down onto the log next to the dead fire pit. I reached for her hand and hers was shaking violently beneath mine. Did you see its face?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread, strained by the force of holding back the scream. I shook my head slowly, forcing the memory back. No, it was just mass, just shadow. The light was wrong. It stopped, she insisted, her gaze still fixed on the timberline, scanning the dense foliage now bathed in golden light. It didn't just walk through. It stopped, right there, between us and them. It looked. It studied us. That was the core horror. It hadn't been accidental. It hadn't been merely passing through. It had positioned itself, surveyed the situation, and then, for reasons we couldn't fathom, moved on, choosing not to engage, choosing not to disrupt the fragile domestic scene before it. The sheer, deliberate choice implied sentience, and that made it infinitely more dangerous than a simple beast. A bear attacks out of hunger or defense. This thing seemed to operate on a completely different set of rules, dictated by some ancient silent calculus. We sat there, frozen, for perhaps another half-hour. The sun rose higher, burning off the last wisps of ground fog. The forest slowly, tentatively, began to remember how to make noise. A chickadee chirped. The drip of water condensation became audible again. The silence was breaking, being replaced by the mundane soundtrack of nature. The return of sound didn't bring comfort. It brought urgency. We had to move. We had to pack up before the children woke and asked why breakfast was delayed, why Mommy and Daddy were sitting rigid with fear, smelling faintly of cold sweat and panic. The packing was the most meticulous, anxious chore of my entire life. We moved with agonizing slowness, our hands trembling over every buckle and strap. Every rustle of leaves was scrutinized. Every branch snap, every bird call, sent a fresh jolt of ice through our spines. We were hyper-alert, tuned to the frequency of pure survival fear, convinced that the slightest mistake would bring the shadow rushing back. We didn't speak about the silhouette again while we packed. It was an unspoken covenant, a necessity born of terror. If we didn't name it, if we didn't articulate the horror, maybe we could convince ourselves it was a shared hallucination, a trick of the sunrise, a collective nightmare brought on by the thin mountain air. But our actions betrayed us. We didn't bother folding the tents. We violently yanked the stakes, collapsing the nylon structures into tangled heaps, shoving them roughly into the gear bags. Precision was gone. We moved with a desperate, frantic haste. Driven by a primal need for evacuation, we were leaving the battlefield. When Tommy, who was 6, finally woke and rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he noticed the frantic pace immediately. "Daddy, why are we leaving? We didn't make s'mores yet," he mumbled, his voice full of sleepy confusion and deep disappointment. I forced a smile onto my face, a terrible, stiff mask of reassurance that I hoped looked marginally less terrifying than the truth. "Change of plans, sport," I managed, my voice sounding rough and alien, as if grit had adhered to my vocal cords. "Weather's changing fast. We gotta beat the rain down the mountain." Sarah nodded vehemently, backing up the lie, already pulling down the camp chairs with such force that they clattered loudly, a sound that made us both flinch. Emily, who was only 4, was quieter. She stood by the cooler, her eyes wide, staring past me toward the edge of the woods. Her gaze wasn't fearful or traumatized. It was contemplative, slightly unfocused, as if she were watching something I couldn't perceive, listening to a conversation taking place on a different frequency. "The tall man is sad, Daddy," she said in that innocent, unblinking way only young children possess, stating a fact as simple as the sky being blue. My blood ran cold. I froze, turning slowly to face her. Sarah dropped a box of matches, and the silence returned, thick and punishing. "What tall man, sweetheart?" I asked, my voice controlled, dangerously quiet, the sound of my heart pounding obscenely loud in my ears. "The big brown man. He was watching us. He's sad now because the sun came up." She pointed directly, deliberately at the stretch of woods where the silhouette had been standing, the precise area where I had found the coarse, dark hair. I rushed to her, kneeling down, pulling her tight against me. I held her face in my hands, scanning her eyes for fear, for trauma, but there was only that innocent, puzzling observation. She hadn't been awakened by our panic. She had seen it too, perhaps through the thin nylon of the tent, or perhaps in a way that transcended physical sight, perceiving the entity's emotional state. "There's no tall man, Emmy," I insisted, desperately clinging to the official version of reality. "Just big trees and nice animals." "He's quiet now," she persisted, whispering this time, looking over my shoulder directly at the trees. "But he wants his blanket back." The scrap of hair I had hidden in the pine needles flashed into my mind. The term blanket, primitive, protective covering. I stood up, feeling a wave of deep, chilling nausea. We were dealing with something far beyond a natural predator. We were dealing with a presence that children recognized, one that communicated not through sound or aggression, but perhaps through sheer, overwhelming emotion, sadness, loneliness, imposition. The decision was made instantly. We weren't just leaving, we were fleeing. We were in full panicked retreat. Within 20 minutes, the van was crammed, chaotic, and sealed. I didn't take the time to secure the luggage on the roof rack properly. I just needed movement, speed, distance. As I pulled out of the campsite, tires churning the loose gravel, I took one last desperate look at the tree line. The golden morning light made the forest look benign, innocent, impossibly beautiful. But I knew the truth. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My face was a mask of cold sweat, adrenaline draining away and leaving behind only dread. We drove faster than was safe down the logging road, the back end fishtailing, kicking up great clouds of dust that obscured our retreat, creating a desperate temporary curtain between us and the woods. Sarah sat silently beside me, one hand resting on the center console, the other holding Emily's small, warm hand. Tommy, confused but sensing the gravity of the situation, was unnaturally quiet in the back seat. It was only when we hit the main highway, where the presence of other cars and the sound of traffic provided a thin, illusory shield of civilization, that I finally allowed myself to breathe deeply. But the air I inhaled wasn't clean. It was still thick with the memory of that ancient, musky scent, the smell of fear, and the lingering residue of a truth that had violated our perception of reality. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that we had not simply observed a creature. We had interrupted a deeply private life, and in those moments of shared silent observation at sunrise, that entity had assessed us, judged us, and ultimately decided our fate. It chose to let us live, to allow us to pack our flawed human lives into our metal box and retreat. But that choice carried a terrifying implication. It knew where we lived. It knew who we were. And the forest, that beautiful, terrifying, vast cathedral of shadows, now held a piece of us. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the road was clear. Yet I had the undeniable, sickening sensation of being watched. Not from the immediate distance, but from an impossible distance, a silent gaze following the metallic flash of the van as it fled the mountain. We never spoke about what Emily said. We never spoke about the sadness or the blanket I had hidden beneath the pine duff. We just drove, heading home to a life that we knew deep down had been irreparably shattered. The innocence of our family trip was gone, replaced by a shared secret, a deep, corrosive trauma that would haunt our dreams and silence our dinner tables for decades to come. And that guilt, the crushing knowledge that I had led them into the hunting grounds of something impossibly old and wise, that guilt became my constant companion, whispering to me every time the shadows lengthened at dusk. I was responsible for bringing my family to the edge of the world and exposing them to a truth that was never meant for human eyes. I was no longer just a husband, a father, or an engineer. I was a witness, and witnesses, especially to things that defy belief, are rarely allowed to live peaceful lives. The mountain had marked us, and I knew even then, driving hundreds of miles away, that the reckoning was only delayed. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silence of that dawn had been a warning, a profound statement that we had encroached, and we would not soon be forgotten. Some things in those woods were never meant for us, but they're still out there, waiting. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there. I had spent 20 years cataloging the sounds of the deep woods, 20 years distinguishing the nervous chatter of a squirrel from the calculated tread of a black bear, the snap of a deer's broken ankle from the sound of a falling dead branch. I knew the forest's language, its mood, its hidden intentions often better than I knew the shifting moods of my own wife. But in those hours, moving from the safe glow of the dying embers toward the black, impenetrable curtain of the surrounding pines, the forest had gone mute. It wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. It was the kind of unnatural, pressurized silence that settles in before an electrical storm hits. A vacuum where the normal symphony of crickets, owls, and the wind sighing through the canopy should have been thriving. My ears were stretched thin, reaching out into the cold air, finding only the sound of my own breath, sharp and shallow, and the frantic drumming inside my chest. That silence had a weight to it, a physical density that pressed down on the back of my neck, making the small hairs stand rigid. It was the feeling you get when you step onto a high ledge and the world opens up beneath you, overwhelming the senses with pure scale. But here, the scale was contained within the darkness, massive and unseen, looming just beyond the ring of our failed campfire light. I walked the perimeter of the 3 tents, a circuit of maybe 60 feet, slow, deliberately casual, though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to grab the children and flee. My flashlight stayed off. Instinct told me that a sudden burst of directed light would not reassure me. It would only confirm that whatever was out there was actively choosing to remain hidden, and worse, would reveal exactly where I was. Then, the smell hit me. It was not the smell of the woods. It was not the damp moss, the pine resin, or the familiar mustiness of old leaf decay. This was primal, organic, and sickeningly potent. It started faintly, a low background note, and intensified as I approached the heavy dark mass of the spruce stand 50 yards to the west, where the old logging road vanished into the undergrowth. It was a mix of things that shouldn't mix. Wet fur, heavy and oily like a dog that hasn't been dried after swimming in sewage. But beneath that, there was a sharp, chemical tang, like burnt ozone or industrial cleaning fluid, which made my eyes sting and throat seize up. And hauntingly, unsettlingly, there was a sweetness to it, a cloying, heavy scent of overripe, rotting fruit, like forgotten plums fermenting under the sun. It was the smell of life pushed too far, of massive biology operating outside the clean, balanced cycle of the ecosystem. It was the smell of ancient muscle and absolute waste. I recognized the architecture of that odor, even though my brain fought the connection. I had smelled something similar 15 years ago, during the massive fires south of the Cascade Line. We found a small cave then deep in the burn zone, where the heat had baked the earth and sterilized the air. Inside, we found the remnants of what looked like a den, not a bear den, too structured, too deep, too many strange polished stones. And the smell that lingered weeks after the fire had swept through was that same oily musk, mixed with sulfurous decay. We wrote it up as a massive, atypical bear sign, but every ranger who saw it exchanged that same silent, knowing look of denial. That smell meant size. It meant predator. And terrifyingly, it meant intelligence. I stood still, gripping the flimsy aluminum pole of my collapsed camp chair, breathing through my mouth to avoid gagging on the heavy air. My attention fixed on the spruce line. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. The darkness was absolute, but the pressure of being watched intensified until it felt like a spotlight was trained directly on my exposed neck. My mind, trained in emergency response, began its frantic checklist. Okay, large omnivore. Bear, possibly an extremely large grizz that migrated down, though geographically improbable. Check the wind. The wind is currently blowing from the west, bringing the scent directly to me. If it's a bear, why is it silent? Why hasn't it approached the coolers? Why is it only focused on the tents? Bears are driven by hunger and territoriality, not silent, sustained observation. Mountain lions are stealthy, but they operate low to the ground and have a distinct guttural vocalization when asserting dominance. Whatever this was, it was standing upright, moving slowly, and seemed more interested in the emotional paralysis it was imposing than any immediate physical threat. The rationality failed. It crumbled right there in the dense, musky air. My decades of experience became useless, replaced by a visceral dread that had no category in the official Forest Service handbook. I took one, single, silent step back toward our tent, my focus still riveted on the spruce line, and then I heard it. It wasn't a sound meant to be heard. It was the sound of displacement, a massive weight shifting, transferring its load from one incredibly large foot to another, just behind the thickest cover of the pines. It wasn't the crunch of pine needles. It was too soft for that, almost deliberate silence. It was the movement of air. A deep, ouch sound, like a heavy coat of fur brushing against the dense bark of a tree trunk, followed by a slight, almost imperceptible groan in the earth itself, the damp soil compressing under immense pressure. The weight. That was the key. Whatever moved out there was impossibly heavy, yet capable of terrifying grace. It moved like a giant trying not to disturb the dust. A new realization dawned, chilling me to the bone far worse than the creeping pre-dawn air. This thing hadn't just arrived. It had been there, silently waiting, perhaps for hours. It had been watching us set up camp, watching the children run and play, watching my wife light the fire. It had let us settle, let us feel safe, only to begin its game of psychological warfare when the world was darkest. It wasn't hunting us for food. It was studying us. My memory flashed back to the only time I had ever been truly stalked in the high country, years before, when I was checking trap lines near the Canadian border. It was a cougar, and its intent was clear. It wanted the easy kill. It moved quickly, decisively, weaving through the brush, covering ground. This was the antithesis of that encounter. This thing was patient, ancient, and seemed to possess an almost bored curiosity, mixed with something profoundly unsettling, a possessiveness over this patch of earth that felt deeper than any animal claim. I finally reached the tent flap where my wife and children slept. I knelt down slowly, trying to keep my movements minimal, blending into the shadows cast by the dying fire. I reached inside the small vestibule and felt around until my fingers closed around the cold, hard plastic grip of the .44 Magnum I always kept disassembled in the camp box. My training told me that introducing a firearm into the situation was a catastrophic risk. If it was a bear, I could potentially scare it off, but I would risk panic. If it was a human predator, the gun was essential. But if it was the other thing, the thing the smell and the silence suggested, the gun was nothing but a fragile, desperate gesture, an insult. I slipped the pistol out and rested it on the ground beside me, taking a moment to assemble it quickly and silently, the familiar metallic click of the cylinder snapping into place a low comfort against the rising tide of panic. My eyes never left the spruce line. It was here that the rationality, the Forest Service mandated explanation, made one last desperate attempt to assert control over the terror. I leaned against the tent pole, trying to look casual, trying to breathe evenly. It's just an elk, a really large bull elk. They can be incredibly silent when they want to be, and they smell strong. The sweetness is the pheromones. It's moving away now. It sensed you watching it, and now it's withdrawing. I clung to that thought for maybe 30 seconds. An elk. A large, startled elk. It made perfect logical sense to a man who refused to believe in ghosts, monsters, or the whispered histories of the native elders. But the fear wouldn't subside. If it was an elk, the fear should dissipate as the animal moved off. Instead, the pressure remained static, concentrated. The air did not lighten, it thickened. The smell did not fade, it clung, acrid and suffocating. I realized then why the logical explanation was failing, because every noise it didn't make was more terrifying than any noise it could have made. If it were an elk, or a bear, or a cougar, it would have broken a branch, kicked a stone, or snorted in the night air. It would have left a trail of audible clues. But the silence surrounding its massive presence spoke volumes about self-control, patience, and absolute, unnerving mastery of the environment. I looked down at the tents, the fragile nylon shells separating my family from the cold, massive sentience lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Inside, my wife stirred slightly, rolling over. A soft, small sigh escaped her lips. The sound of her oblivious comfort was a knife twisting in my gut. I was supposed to be the protector, the seasoned expert who brought them to safety. Instead, I had led them onto a stage where something colossal was waiting for the curtain to rise. I knew with the cold certainty of a man facing the gallows that I had been found wanting. The forest had allowed us this time of peace, this illusion of safety, only to dramatically revoke the privilege now in the deepest part of the night. The waiting stretched on, an eternity compressed into an hour before the first suggestion of gray light began to thin the eastern horizon. And with that first faint hint of dawn, the pressure around the spruce line seemed to shift. Not withdraw, shift, like a colossal entity preparing to step out of the wings and onto the stage. The silhouette was still hidden, but the displacement sound was gone. The heavy, musky air intensified, and I could feel my own heart hammering a wild, syncopated beat against the stillness of the slowly awakening world. The truth, the terrible, towering truth, was about to be illuminated by the rising sun, and I had nowhere left to run. All my explanations, all my logic, were reduced to ash. I was simply waiting for the inevitable appearance of what I now understood was not a wild animal, but something far, far older, something that held the title deed to these woods, and had just decided to inspect the temporary squatters on its land. I raised the heavy .44, knowing it was useless, knowing that the confrontation was no longer a matter of survival, but of witness. I was about to see what had broken my life's logic, and I could only pray that the final revelation would not break my family as well. The darkness was beginning to peel back, and the scale of the Watcher was about to be revealed. The sun was no longer a promise. It was a brutal, blinding reality. It sliced through the canopy, not with the gentle warmth of a new day, but with an accusatory sharpness exposing the truth of the last 10 minutes. The giant silhouette was gone. It had vanished into the deep shadows that were rapidly retreating across the eastern slope, retreating like a phantom caught in the morning light. But the space it had occupied, the air it had displaced, remained saturated with its presence. My heart was not pounding anymore. It was stuttering, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, irregular and weak. I stood there, rooted, still gripping the heavy lantern that now felt uselessly small. My wife, Sarah, was next to me, her hand pressed hard against her mouth, not to stifle a scream, but perhaps to hold her very breath inside, preventing it from escaping into that violated air. The kids, God, the kids, they hadn't moved. They stood like statues, frozen by the transition from deep sleep to utter terror. Their eyes, wide and reflecting the terrible morning light, were locked on the space between the fire pit and the ridgeline. That space, that sacred, small stretch of ground that separated our temporary shelter from the hostile world, that's where it had been. And that's where the evidence lay, though at first we couldn't bring ourselves to look down. We were still looking up, watching the trees, waiting for the return of the impossible angle, the impossible height. "We need to move," Sarah finally whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound that barely carried the length of her own body. "We need to pack. Now." She didn't suggest coffee, didn't ask if anyone needed the bathroom, didn't even mention breakfast. The ritual of the camping trip, the reason we were out here, had been annihilated. There was only one imperative: escape. But I couldn't just leave. The ranger in me, the part that dealt with fires, floods, and missing persons, the part that needed to catalog and report the unusual, demanded answers. I had to know what had stood there. I had to confirm what my eyes had already told me, even if my mind refused to process the data. I took a slow, agonizing step forward toward the dying embers of the fire. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the scent of wood smoke, nor the clean, sharp aroma of pine sap, nor the damp earthiness of the dew-laden forest floor. It was something primal, something profoundly wrong. It was thick, musky, and faintly sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot in wet fur. It coated the back of my throat, forcing a small, involuntary retch. It was the smell of enormous, powerful life, unchecked and unwashed, bearing the deep, earthy taint of something that lived wholly outside the boundaries of human interaction. It smelled ancient. I knelt down, ignoring Sarah's frantic, silent signals to hurry. The ground told the story. The fire pit was intact, the ring of stones undisturbed, but the earth immediately surrounding it, that area was compromised. It wasn't a set of clear, perfect footprints you see in museum casts. This creature, whatever it was, had not been carelessly lumbering. It had been walking on soft, yielding pine needles and rich, dark soil, and it had been aware of where its massive weight was falling. But even with that care, the pressure exerted was immense. I ran my hand over the ground where the silhouette's torso would have been, a line maybe 3 feet from the cooling stones. The layer of pine needles, usually springy and resistant, was pressed flat. Not just bent, but compacted, almost laminated to the soil beneath. I traced the edge of a depression, a wide, shallow indentation that could not possibly belong to a bear. A bear walks on 4 paws, distributing its weight differently. A human stride is narrow. This implied a colossal bipedal structure, a devastating downward force. I found another indentation maybe 6 feet away. 6 feet. That was the distance of a confident, powerful stride. I could barely manage 4 feet in a full sprint. This was the gait of something engineered for effortless movement across difficult terrain, a stride that ate up distance without strain. "Dad," my son Mark finally spoke. His voice was shockingly small, a thread of sound unraveling the silence. "Look." He wasn't looking at the ground. He was pointing toward the stand of dense hemlock that formed a natural curtain behind our sleeping area. I stood up, shaking off the paralysis of the ground study. The hemlocks were tall, 50, 60 feet high. And about 10 feet up, maybe a little more, a thick branch as thick as my arm had been snapped cleanly in 2. It wasn't rotten. The fracture was green, fresh, exposing the wet, pale wood underneath. It was too high for any deer to rub, too high for a bear to easily reach without climbing. And if a bear had climbed, it would have left claw marks or torn the bark. This looked like something had simply reached out, grasped it and broken it off, perhaps absently, perhaps to test its own strength, or perhaps just to clear a path. Why? Why break a branch 10 feet up while walking on the ground? It occurred to me, with a sickening lurch of the stomach, that the branch might not have been broken by an arm. If the thing was as tall as it appeared, if it matched the impression of that horrifying vertical line, it might have broken that branch simply by turning its head. The implications of that scale were catastrophic to my worldview. We were supposed to be the apex predator. We were the dominant species capable of conquering and classifying everything, but this thing defied classification, and in its presence we were reduced to panicked prey. Sarah was already moving toward the first tent, the one our youngest daughter Emily was in. She didn't roll up the sleeping bags. She shoved them, tangled and crumpled, into the oversized duffels. She wasn't folding the chairs, she was collapsing them violently. Efficiency born of terror. I watched her for a moment, the desperate need for speed etching lines of stress around her eyes. I had to regain control. I had to become the pragmatic adult, the capable father, the trained professional, even if inside, the ranger was screaming for his life. "Mark, help your mother with the bags," I said, forcing a calm, low tone that sounded foreign even to my own ears. "Jesse, start pulling the stakes. We're leaving everything else." That was the key. We were abandoning gear. A camper never abandons gear. Gear is survival. But now gear was a liability, a delay we couldn't afford. The tents, the cooking equipment, the coolers, they could all stay. The cost of replacing them was infinitely less than the cost of spending another hour in this valley. As I started to dismantle our tent, our flimsy blue nylon barrier against the night, the full scope of the violation hit me again. The silhouette had walked between us and our tents. It had stood maybe 15 feet from where we slept. It hadn't made a sound. It hadn't growled, hadn't scraped its foot, hadn't even audibly breathed. How can something so immense move with such absolute, perfect silence? I remembered the deer from the previous night, the sudden, panicked scatter. They weren't reacting to our campfire or to a curious coyote. They were reacting to this. They knew the silent hunter had entered the clearing. They heard the shift in the air pressure, the subtle tremor of the earth that my sleeping human ears had missed. They were communicating the threat long before our rational minds could even conceive of it. I worked methodically, though my hands shook so violently I kept dropping the tent poles. I realized I was wiping the sweat off my forehead, even though the morning air was cold. My adrenaline was spiking wildly, fueling a manic speed. We had 2 cars, the old family SUV and my beat-up pickup truck, which was usually reserved for firewood runs and heavy loads. We decided to cram everything, all 4 of us, plus the hastily stuffed duffels, into the SUV. It was faster, safer, and had better tires for the dirt road. We threw the heavy bags into the back hatch, Sarah barking quiet directions at the kids, transforming her fear into an almost military efficiency. The children, bless them, were utterly silent and compliant, their shock overriding any childish complaints. They understood the stakes instinctively. They knew this was not a drill. As I secured the last duffel, I paused, looking back at the campsite. It was an appalling mess. 2 deflated tents lying like discarded skins, a scattering of pots and plates, the smell of cheap coffee grounds mixed with the heavy, musky odor that was beginning to dissipate slightly, thankfully, as the air warmed. It looked like a natural disaster had struck, not a leisurely family trip interrupted. And then I saw it, lying near where the fire pit met the line of the forest. The third piece of evidence, the one that broke me. It was my younger daughter Emily's favorite plush toy, a worn, faded rabbit named Barnaby. Emily had slept with Barnaby every night since she was 3. Barnaby had been zipped securely inside her sleeping bag, inside her tent. There was no way Barnaby should have been outside, especially not lying face down, half buried in the pressed pine needles right at the edge of the shadow line. My stomach dropped into the cold earth. I walked over, my movements stiff and unnatural, and picked up the rabbit. It was slightly damp with dew, but otherwise unharmed. But it had been moved. This wasn't just a giant animal passing through. This was intelligent interaction. This meant the creature, whatever it was, had been close enough, silent enough, and curious enough to somehow access a child's toy. Had it reached into the tent? Had it picked it up while the children slept? Had it studied it? And then why leave it there, half concealed? Was it a warning? A sign of presence? Or was it, most disturbingly, an act of play? The careless discard of a fascinating object. My hands started to tremble again, the rabbit feeling heavy and accusatory in my grip. This thing had been intimately involved in our space. It hadn't merely walked past. It had observed us, studied us, maybe even handled the objects that belonged to our sleeping child. I looked back at the SUV. Sarah was strapping the kids in, her face set in a grim mask. I knew I couldn't tell her about Barnaby, not yet. The image of this immense, shadow-covered intelligence examining my child's toy would shatter her completely. I stuffed the rabbit into my jacket pocket, a terrible secret pressed against my chest. I took one last sweeping look around the periphery of the clearing. The forest was waking up, but not normally. There were no bird songs, only the sound of the wind sighing through the upper branches, a cold, empty sound. The silence was the real killer. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the suffocating absence of all sound that normally signifies life. It was the silence that comes after the predator has arrived and every other creature is holding its breath, praying it hasn't been seen. I got into the driver's seat of the SUV. The engine turned over instantly, a gratifying mechanical roar that cut through the silence. I put the gear shift into drive, gravel crunching under the tires. "Don't look back," I instructed, my voice flat and controlled, addressing everyone in the vehicle. "We don't stop until we hit the highway." As we pulled out, accelerating quickly down the rutted track, I tried desperately to construct a narrative, an explanation that could possibly hold up under scrutiny, even if it couldn't hold up under the weight of the enormous shadow I had witnessed. It was a large bear. But the stride was wrong, the height was wrong, and the silence was wrong. It was a hallucination caused by lack of sleep and the campfire light. But Sarah saw it, Mark saw it, and the pressed earth and the broken branch were real. It was a prank, some sick person in a costume. No person moves that way or smells that way or possesses that impossible, overwhelming sense of antiquity. We drove in silence for the first 20 minutes. The sun was now fully up, washing the forest in golden light, making the dense, dark woods look deceptively inviting. But I knew the truth. That light was a lie. The wilderness, usually my sanctuary, was now just a vast, indifferent tomb, filled with things that we, as civilized beings, had conveniently forgotten existed. When we finally hit the paved county road, Sarah let out a long, shuddering breath. The sound was ragged, a release of pressure that had built up to a catastrophic degree. "What are we going to tell them?" she asked, not looking at me, but staring straight ahead at the asphalt rushing beneath us. The ranger station, the missing gear, the fact that we abandoned the tents. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The official story was already forming, hardening like fast-setting concrete, sealing off the truth. The official story had to be safe, logical, and digestible. It had to protect my career, our insurance, and, most importantly, the fragile minds of my children. "We tell them," I said, the words tasting like metal, "that we woke up to the sound of an aggressive animal, a very large grizzly, circling the campsite. We were worried about the children. We packed the essentials and fled immediately for their safety. We couldn't risk staying to pack out the rest of the site." I didn't mention the stride. I didn't mention the overpowering stench. I certainly didn't mention the height, the unsettling silence, or the stolen and abandoned toy rabbit. I was already becoming complicit, joining the long lineage of people who have seen the impossible and chosen silence, not out of fear of ridicule, but out of a deep, soul-crushing terror of the truth itself. The explanation felt thin, paper-thin against the mountainous reality of what we had seen, but it was sufficient. It was the acceptable lie, the social contract we sign with normalcy. As we continued driving, the familiar world slowly rushed back in, passing cars, farmhouses, the smell of freshly cut hay replacing the primal musk. We were leaving the terror behind, physically distancing ourselves from the location, but I knew with the cold certainty of a man who had seen the unseen that the shadow hadn't stayed put. The silhouette was not confined to that small, temporary campsite. It was part of the fabric of those woods, ancient and patient, and now it was part of us too. A piece of it had walked out with us, riding in the front pocket of my jacket, nestled against the damp fur of a child's toy rabbit, a haunting reminder that we had been watched, catalogued, and ultimately dismissed. The air grew thinner, colder, impossibly still after the thing had passed. The silence that followed was not the natural silence of a wilderness recovering from a sudden noise, but a vast, suffocating vacuum where all ambient sound had been violently sucked away, leaving only the sound of my own blood hammering against the inside of my temples. For what felt like an hour, maybe only 20 seconds, we remained statues, molded by terror to the picnic table bench, our eyes fixed on the empty space where the colossal darkness had been only moments before. The light was strengthening now, throwing the surrounding trees into sharp, almost painful relief. The mist, which had acted like a curtain pulled across the stage of our horror, was beginning to dissipate, revealing the mundane reality of cheap nylon tents and forgotten cooking utensils, a picture of domestic tranquility utterly shattered by the primal memory we now shared. My wife, Sarah, was the first to move, or rather to shatter. It wasn't a scream, which would have been easier to process, but a sound caught in her throat, a dry, ragged gasp like tearing cloth. Her grip on my forearm was so fierce it left white, bloodless patches on my skin for days afterwards. She didn't look at the space where the creature had stood. She looked at the tent, specifically at the narrow, zippered flap of the kids' tent, trembling slightly as the weak morning breeze caught the fabric. She was measuring the distance, calculating the proximity of that shadow to the two most precious, vulnerable lives we possessed. It was guilt, heavy and immediate, that finally broke my paralysis. I was the one who had insisted on this remote campsite, praising the solitude, the lack of light pollution, the genuine wildness. I had brought them here, promising safety under my care, and I had delivered them directly to the observation post of something ancient and terrifying. I stood up, slowly, pushing the cheap aluminum bench back with a painful screech that sounded deafening in the unnatural quiet. My legs were unsteady, feeling alien and heavy like walking on stilts. I needed to inspect the ground, to find proof, to confirm that my mind hadn't manufactured a collective hallucination born of exhaustion and residual campfire smoke. But the instinctive, survival part of my brain screamed against it. Every fiber told me that to step toward the tents was to re-enter the creature's immediate sphere of influence, to acknowledge its presence, to invite scrutiny. We didn't speak, not truly, until we were back in the relative confinement of the truck cab. The kids, miraculously, were still asleep, cocooned in their mummy bags. I remember the bizarre sight of Sarah and I silently moving through the campsite like specters, dismantling the entire setup with a clinical efficiency born of pure, desperate adrenaline. We didn't fold the tents. We just stuffed them violently into their bags, ripping out stakes and throwing gear into the back seat without care. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call now felt like a warning, a deliberate acoustic deception intended to lure us into a false sense of security. When I knelt beside the spot where the silhouette had paused, I felt it immediately. The ground was slightly softer here, a patch of damp earth and pine needles near the dead fire pit. It wasn't a footprint in the traditional sense, not the perfectly defined track you see in plaster casts. This was different. This was compression. The earth hadn't just been stepped on. It had been crushed, utterly compacted beneath a weight I couldn't rationally assign to any living creature I knew. If a large bear had walked there, the pads would have been distinct, the claw marks visible. If a moose, the cloven hooves would have cut the dirt. This was a smooth, immense depression, a vague, elongated oval, perhaps 1.5 feet long, sunk deeper than any human could manage, even wearing heavy boots and carrying a burden. It spoke volumes about the sheer mass of the entity, suggesting musculature and bone structure that defied mammalian standards. I knelt there, pushing my own fingers into the depression, trying to gauge the effort required, and felt a wave of dizzying disorientation. It was a pressure point in the earth, a singular spot where gravity seemed to have been intensified by a factor of 10, and it was the undeniable, physical proof that our eyes had not deceived us. The smell lingered too, faintly now, diluted by the morning dew, but still traceable. It was a complex, aggressive scent, not just musk or decay, but something intensely organic, like a mixture of wet, unwashed wool, ozone just before a thunderstorm, and the sweet, almost sickly sweet smell of overripe mushrooms. It was the scent of antiquity, of something that lived not merely in the wilderness but was the wilderness, a mobile ecosystem of its own. We drove away before the sun truly cleared the horizon, leaving the site looking like it had been hastily abandoned during an evacuation. We didn't stop until we reached the first small town 30 miles down the logging road, a place with a greasy diner and the kind of cheap, stale coffee that tasted like bitter safety. This is where the second wave of trauma began, the collision between unvarnished truth and institutional denial. When we finally managed to place a call to the local sheriff's department, a small, understaffed operation 30 miles further down the valley, the reaction was immediate, polite, and utterly dismissive. I remember sitting in the plastic booth, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, trying to articulate the impossible to a deputy whose voice sounded bored and thick with morning phlegm. I was articulate, measured, providing detail, the precise location, the time of the sighting, the size, the movement. The deputy's first question wasn't about the creature. It was about consumption. "Sir, can I ask if you or your wife had consumed any alcoholic beverages the night before, or perhaps any medication that could affect perception?" The insult, cloaked in professional protocol, stung worse than any physical pain. I had been a responsible camper, a professional man, and my sanity was being questioned because the truth I offered was inconvenient. The partial explanation, the official version that would later circulate in whispers and then eventually be filed away in a dusty cabinet labeled "Unresolved Wildlife Encounters," arrived with Sheriff Harding himself. He wasn't unkind, just supremely pragmatic and tired. Harding was the type of man who had dealt with everything from meth labs to missing hikers, and he approached our trauma with the detached professionalism of a mechanic diagnosing a failing engine. He drove out to the site with a younger ranger, a man named Jesse whose eyes avoided ours constantly. They spent maybe 15 minutes on the ground, 15 minutes to process the evidence of an encounter that had nearly broken my family. When Harding came back to the truck, wiping dust from his uniform pants, he offered the classic layered explanations, delivered with the cadence of a man who had practiced this speech hundreds of times before. "Look, I understand you folks had a frightening experience," he started, leaning against the fender, the morning chill still sharp in the air. "But we've got to look at the facts. You were camping deep in Class 3 grizzly territory. We've had a few reports of a particularly large male moving through this basin. What you saw, especially in that low light, that fog, that's classic misidentification, heightened by fear. The light plays tricks, the shadows stretch." I pointed toward the area near the fire pit. "Sheriff, look at the compression. That was not a bear. A bear walks on all fours and its tracks are distinct. This was bipedal. It was upright." Harding shrugged, a gesture of weary acceptance. A large male grizzly standing up on its hind legs to inspect the site. They can get big, real big. They often stand up before they charge, or if they're just curious about a new smell. The ground here is soft. A 1,000-pound animal standing on its rear legs? That'll leave a deep mark, sure. The ranger, Jesse, chimed in, almost too quickly, as if reading from a cue card. "And the smell, sir? That intense musky odor? That's prime rutting season for some of the larger mammals. Moose, big bear, even territorial elk can put off a powerful stench. It's the wilderness. Everything smells rank out here." It was a perfectly packaged, perfectly logical explanation designed not to comfort us, but to neutralize the threat of a public panic. It was the official narrative, delivered with finality. Case closed, emotional reaction confirmed, wildlife misidentification. But it didn't hold up, not for a moment. I am an engineer by trade. I think in terms of structural integrity, pressure distribution, and kinetic energy. The track I felt, the sheer depth of the compression, argued against a momentary stand-up of a bear. A bear sways. This entity had planted itself with the stability of a sequoia. And the movement, the slow, deliberate walk, the calculated pause, the fact that it had walked between our sleeping children and us, knowing exactly where the vulnerable points were, yet choosing not to engage, only to observe. Bears don't move with that kind of calculated, intelligent reserve. They are driven by hunger, territory, or defense. This was driven by contemplation. I remember staring at Sheriff Harding, feeling a cold, deep rage settle in my gut. They weren't lying, not exactly. They were simply choosing the path of least resistance, the explanation that maintained the delicate balance of the civilized world against the wild. They couldn't afford to admit that something of that scale, of that intelligence, existed outside the known parameters of biology. To admit that was to shatter the foundation of their jurisdiction. They handed us a form, an accident report, asking us to sign off on the bear encounter documentation. Sarah signed it immediately, wanting only absolution and escape. She wanted the nightmare to have a name that could be filed away and forgotten. I refused. "I can't sign this, Sheriff," I said, my voice low and steady, feeling every word as a betrayal of my own sanity. "Because it wasn't a bear, and you know it." Harding's eyes narrowed slightly. That was the moment our relationship shifted from victim and responder to accuser and silencer. "Mr. Peterson," he said, using my last name with a new, sharp formality. "You had a terrifying night. Your family is safe. That's what matters. If you insist on pushing an unsubstantiated claim of something supernatural, I have to warn you. The Forest Service will treat this as a potential psychological disturbance, and will have to involve Child Protective Services to ensure the well-being of your children. We need to close this file." The threat was clear, brutal, and effective. The bureaucracy of sanity was weaponized against me. I had a choice: protect the truth, or protect my family. I signed the form. My hand shook as I scrawled my name, feeling the weight of the lie settle over me like a shroud. I signed away the truth of that sunrise encounter, trading it for the immediate safety of my children, for the guarantee that the state wouldn't pry them away based on my hallucination. But the moment I signed, the obsession began. That signature was a promise I made to the officials, but the memory was a debt I owed to myself. We drove back to the city, the journey in agonizing silence punctuated only by the soft breathing of the children, who mercifully slept through the worst of the emotional fallout. When we unpacked at home, the trauma manifested in strange ways. Sarah couldn't look at the camping gear. She insisted we throw it all away. The tents, the sleeping bags, the cheap folding chairs, as if the synthetic material had absorbed the creature's essence. The sight of a dense shadow outside our suburban window sent her heart racing. For me, the trauma became investigative. The guilt festered. I should have looked closer. I should have defied the sheriff. I owed the creature, or at least the reality of it, more respect than I had given it in my fear and subsequent compliance. I couldn't accept the bare explanation. It was a failure of physics, a failure of observation. The feeling of being watched never left me. It wasn't just a lingering paranoia. It was a sensory memory baked into my nervous system. I would wake up in the middle of the night, certain that the glass of the window was vibrating slightly, responding to a distant, immense footfall miles away, across the sleeping city, deep in the mountains. The logical professional man I had been was replaced by a haunted investigator. I began to pore over topographical maps examining the deep, dark creases of the land near that specific campsite. I started researching historical accounts, old tribal legends, and yes, the crackpot theories of cryptozoology I had previously scoffed at. I needed context for the impossible weight I had felt pressing down on the earth near our fire. I knew, with a dreadful certainty that eclipsed the sheriff's bureaucratic cover story, that the creature had not simply stumbled upon us. It had been monitoring us deliberately. It was aware of our boundaries and had chosen to violate them in the most effective way possible, not through violence, but through a calculated display of sheer, overwhelming presence, delivered at the psychological breaking point of dawn. It had offered a warning, not a threat. And the consequence of that warning, amplified by the official denial, was the corrosion of my marriage and the destruction of my inner peace. Sarah saw a danger we had narrowly escaped and wanted to forget. I saw a truth we had narrowly glimpsed and needed to understand. The path diverged there. She wanted the closure of the bear report. I needed the confrontation. I knew I would have to go back. Not with gear, not with family, but alone. I needed to stand in that spot again, stripped of the comforting noise of civilization, and confront the silence, the smell, and the truth of that crushing weight. The woods were now calling me back, not as a recreational visitor, but as a reluctant witness summoned to the trial of my own suppressed memory. The official report was signed, sealed, and filed, but the real investigation was only just beginning, and I was stepping into the darkness armed only with a gnawing guilt and a terrified, unshakable memory of a colossal silhouette walking patiently, intelligently, in the breaking light of a ruined morning. The fear was still there, but now, a bitter, dangerous curiosity had taken root. I needed to know what had been watching us, and why it had let us go. It was no longer just a shadow cast by something moving quickly through the peripherals. It was the thing itself, solidified by the agonizing slowness of the dawn. The light, that cruel, hesitant light, was just enough to confirm the impossible architecture of its frame, but not enough to give us any defining features. It stood exactly where the path curved, where the clearing gave way to the dense thicket we had to traverse to reach the ford, the tents now a useless, brightly colored graveyard behind it. The silence that followed the shift in its position, that shift that put its towering mass directly between us and anything resembling safety or sanity, was the deepest, most corrosive silence I have ever experienced. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the active, suffocating cancellation of sound. Even the normal, mundane noises of the forest, the chatter of a distant jay, The drip of dew from the pines, the gentle crackle of the embers, were absorbed by the sheer physical volume of its presence. My heart was a heavy, wet drum against my ribs, and I could taste the metallic tang of adrenaline in my throat. I remember focusing on my own breath, trying to slow the panicked wheezing, terrified that the sound of my lungs failing me would be the final trigger. My wife, Sarah, pressed into the side of the boulder we had sought refuge behind, her body a rigid, non-negotiable fortress around the two small forms of our children. Her face, half turned away from the silhouette, was pale and damp, reflecting the sickly gray-pink hue of the nascent sunrise. I didn't look at her. I couldn't afford to look at her. If I allowed the crushing reality of their proximity to death to sink in, I knew I would break. And breaking meant movement, and movement meant attracting the attention we were so desperately trying to avoid. My entire world narrowed down to the space between the crown of that towering head and the matted, shadowed earth beneath its feet. It stood perhaps 20 feet away, but the distance felt entirely irrelevant. It held the space. It controlled the moment. It was a monument carved from shadow and ancient wet fur, seemingly defying the very physics of mass and gravity. The way the light, weak as it was, struggled to wrap around its form suggested an impossible density. It didn't just occupy space, it displaced the atmosphere, making the air around it thicker, heavier, colder. I tried desperately to find detail, some small clarifying element that would reduce it to a known animal, a giant bear perhaps, diseased or mutated, something that a bullet or a roar might deter. But the form was distinctly, terrifyingly upright. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the head set low, forward, perpetually watching. And then there was the smell. It returned with an overwhelming force that felt physical, like having a heavy cloak thrown over my face. It wasn't just musk, though. That was certainly there. Deep, earthy, and rank, like a mix of wet moss and concentrated primal sweat. But underneath that, there was a strange, almost chemical sharpness, like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with something sweet and profoundly unsettling, akin to fermenting fruit left rotting in a dark cellar. It was the smell of something ancient, something that metabolized the forest itself, a scent that was meant to warn, to repulse, to stake a territorial claim that spanned millennia. The worst part, the true psychological torture that began to unravel the frayed edges of my sanity, was that it wasn't moving. It was completely still. It wasn't pacing. It wasn't scratching. It wasn't snuffling the ground. It was simply standing, patiently waiting, assessing. I remember the primal terror of that realization. This was not a predator driven by immediate hunger or territorial panic. This was an intelligent presence that had weighed our options, evaluated our panic, and decided that its best move was no move at all. It was waiting for yes to make the mistake. I looked at the ground near its feet, trying to track the movement of the dying firelight flickering on the pine needle floor. I had to know if it was breathing. I held my own breath until my vision swam, forcing myself to strain my ears past the roaring in my head. And then, I heard it. Not a sound intended for communication, but a sound of existence. A low, slow, gargantuan inhalation, like a deep well drawing air. It was heavy, wet, and incredibly measured. It was the sound of a living machine running on an ancient, powerful clockwork. It was so slow, so deliberate, that it suggested infinite time. It could stand there for hours, days even, while we perished from cold and thirst. The sheer volume of its silence forced my mind to spiral, pulling me back through the entire preceding 24 hours. My guilt began to claw its way out from beneath the layer of terror. Why did I ignore the unnatural quiet the moment we arrived? Why did I laugh off the broken branches that were too high for any known animal? Why, dear God, did I bring my family, the most precious things in my broken, fragile life, to this secluded, forgotten corner of the wilderness, simply because the map promised isolation? Isolation was what we got. Isolation from sanity, from help, from reality itself. I remembered the gentle, almost invisible pressure I had felt the night before, that sense of being watched through the canvas of the tent. It hadn't been a feeling of unease. It was a feeling of scrutiny. We hadn't been camping. We had been subjects in an observation experiment conducted by something far older and wiser than us. And now, the observer had simply stepped into the light. I glanced down at Sarah's hand, clenched tight around the hilt of the small hunting knife she had somehow managed to grab from the emergency kit before we scrambled out. It was a pathetic defense against the massive, monolithic silhouette before us. Yet her grip was absolute, unwavering. That small, white-knuckled fist, protecting our children, became my anchor. I couldn't move, but I had to prepare to move. I found my own knife, a thick bowie I always carried, and slowly, deliberately, placed my thumb on the release catch of the sheath. The tiny, almost imperceptible click of the metal latch felt louder than a gunshot in the vacuum of that dawn. I froze, my muscles seizing, convinced that the slightest disturbance would shatter the fragile truce of the moment. The silhouette remained still. If it heard the sound, it gave no indication. It was as though its awareness operated on a scale far beyond the triviality of human sounds. It was listening to the earth, to the wind, perhaps to the collective, pounding fear emanating from our small, huddled cluster. I had to find the eyes. Everything I had ever read, every legend, every half-whispered story from old-timers in the logging camps, insisted that the eyes were the key. The intelligence, the ancient, sorrowful gaze that either communicated a warning or a final verdict. I strained, fighting the natural tendency of my own eyes to follow the bulk of the torso. I focused on the space where the neck met the skull, trying to pierce the gloom. The head was lowered, slightly tilted, not aggressively but inquisitively. It was the posture of deep thought, not imminent attack. And then I saw the way the light died within two small almond-shaped depressions. There was no reflection, no predatory gleam like a nocturnal animal caught in a headlight. Instead, there was a profound absence of light, a depth that suggested black velvet stretched over infinite space. They were,